You developed the Therapy for Black Girls platform, your online platform, which has been hugely successful. According to what I read, it was sparked by you watching Black Girls Rock, which I believe used to come on VH1, um, and which was a celebration of Black women. What was it about Black Girls Rock that made you sense that Black women needed a communal mental health space?
So I think watching the award show, it just felt so beautiful, right? Like, and I've never had the privilege of attending one in person, but even just watching it on TV, like, people dancing together and like giving each other, literally giving each other flowers and celebrating one another. And I thought the energy was just so infectious and palpable. And I thought, it would be cool to like capture some of this energy around mental health. Like, what kind of thing could I offer that would like allow people to come alive and be excited and, embracing one another and discussing mental health. And so after I watched the award show, then Therapy for Black Girls came to me. And I started blogging on the site, and it really kind of has just taken off from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's become an extraordinarily robust community since you started it. And because I'm trying to think of when I first started hearing about you, I think it was like a couple years ago. And there, you provided probably the resource that is very vital, especially to Black women who want to explore their mental health, which is finding a Black therapist. Okay, I have
Hmm.
a Black woman therapist. Other friends of mine who are in therapy have been lucky enough to find one, and I found one mine through word of mouth. The way there's a particular chapter in your book that I really found very fascinating when because a lot of therapists that women go to, Black women go to, especially if they're not Black, will not talk about the impact of white supremacy, racism, and sexism on their mental health. But this is something that you have really followed and studied for throughout your career. What were some of the challenges of sort of bringing a Black woman's experience to the study of psychology and to like inform that in your approach?
I don't know that there really have been challenges because again, I feel like so much of my career development was people pushing me forward and saying, "Absolutely, go forward and study this." And so that the chapter that you're referring to is Sisters Over Systems, that talks
Yep.
about all of the different ways that like our culture is really not set up to actually foster sisterhood, right? So the idea that there could be only one successful Black girl in a company, or the idea that we are taught to kind of prioritize romantic relationships as opposed to friendships. Like all of that really works against sisterhood. And so in that chapter, I really wanted to talk about, hey, how can we actually view these systems as the problem and not one another? And Jamel, I feel like in an early iteration of the book, I'm not sure where this got chopped, but I feel like you and Carrie gave us such a beautiful example, Carrie Champion, when you were both guests on Red Table Talk and talking about, how you all, the system kind of wanted to pit you against one another, but you all really kind of latched on to one another and said, hey, we're going to come up the ranks together. And I think I would love to just see more of that because it isn't true that only one of us can be successful, but the systems that we often find ourselves in would lead us to believe that when it's just not true.
So yeah, let's unpack because you said so much stuff in this book about Black female friendship dynamics, especially in a group that I am so taken to my groups and my sister circles that I have. But let's start to kind of where the genesis of how a lot of us look at our Black female friendships. It is because you have early on in the book sort of a section that was, I think it was somebody else's experience you were sharing. It was called Messages from Mama, where this young lady named Tamara was talking about sort of the things that she learned from her mother about Black women, how to relate to them. So let's start there. How do our mother's relationship with Black women, with other Black women, how does that influence our own?
I think it sets up a model for what either will be healthy relationships or not so healthy relationships or no relationships at all, right? So if we see our moms flourishing in relationships with girlfriends, if they talk positively about other women, if they encourage us to have relationships with other women, then it is likely that we continue that into adulthood. But in the book, I talk about this story from Tamara where she shares her mother being very critical of other girls in her life, right? And saying like, you can't tell them too much. People always have, ulterior motives. And so those kinds of seeds get planted. And then when we become adults, then we don't trust other women, right? So this is this idea that I'm a guy's girl, or, women are not to be trusted. Some of those early seeds that are planted by our mothers, grandmothers, and aunties are what really develop into these kind of, I think, maladaptive relationships, or, not wanting to have relationships with other women because we've not been taught that they could be trusted.
Yeah, because it made me think about what I was told from my mother growing up is that my mother did have a lot of untrustworthy friends. Now, she was suffering through an addiction, and when you are, you're going to have a lot of untrustworthy friends. And so that was always her message to me was like, they are not to be trusted. You can't, you should be careful about who you're around. It's the ones closest to you that hurt you. So I've been
Right.
inundated. Even still, my mother inundates me with those messages, even though my friendships, like I've been lucky, fortunate that I've never had to break up with a friend. I've never had to do
Nice.
it. Okay. Right. I've been
We
really
love that.
lucky. And you go through a whole chapter about what that is like. And I have some questions surrounding that. And so if we're inundated with these messages from women in our initial community, mothers, aunties, about don't trust no woman around your man and all that other kind of stuff,
Mhm.
how do we go about the process of breaking those negative perceptions that have formed within us about Black or friendships with Black women?
So I think we have to first be open to it, because if we've received those messages, we may not even be looking into relationships with other women, right? And so I think an openness to it is first important, but usually it only takes one good relationship with a sister to really kind of change your life, right? So one person who really connects with you, who really shows you like, oh, this person can be trusted, they have my back, they show up when I need them to, I can trust them with secrets, they're not trying to flirt with my partner, like all of those things I think become corrective emotional experiences for us. And then it makes us realize like, oh, okay, that thing that mom told me wasn't the complete truth, right? So there are other ways that I can have relationships with other Black women.
You shared a belief in your book that came from bell hooks that sisterhood is resistance. Why do you believe that's the case?
So I think it goes back to our earlier conversation around sisters over systems, right? So when we really join forces with one another, there really is no stopping what we can't do with one another. And so I think when we look at the places that we find ourselves in, combating racism, combating sexism, those kinds of things, it is stronger when we are able to do that together. And so I think, and when she talks about it being resistance, it is really about pooling our resources, pooling our knowledge, pooling our time and energies together to fight against a system that's bigger than us.
Now, even as you made in that chapter where you address how the impact of white supremacy and racism and the patriarchy on Black women in the workplace in particular, how we might relate to one another. You talk a lot about how we should, as you just said, point and finger point at the system and not necessarily at the person. And yet, yeah, it's like that Chris Rock joke. Where that he says about how every Black woman has another Black woman at her job she can't stay. Right. And well, I've certainly been in that camp where I've had to be unfortunately in a work environment with Black women like that who seem to be willing to undermine us at every turn. um, what is your advice about how we can handle those relationships while also setting some boundaries about treatment and how we might interact with that type of person in the workplace?
I first think it's so unfortunate when we find ourselves in situations with other sisters, and too many of us sadly have a similar story, right? It's typically an older Black woman who maybe has been at the company longer, and there's just this resistance to like this new person kind of coming in. And I think about how unfortunate it is that she maybe didn't have like loving, affirming experiences with other Black women, so that she can't then offer that to someone else. And so, even though it is unfortunate for her, that doesn't mean we have to be mistreated, right? So when you talk about setting boundaries, I think that that's really important. And so even if some of those conversations are difficult, I think it's okay to say to someone like, hey, it makes me feel judged when you talk to me like this, or I don't appreciate when you make comments like that. I think you do still need to speak up for yourself. And also, I think knowing that about this person lets you know how you need to interact with them, right? So you clearly know this person is not an ally for you. And so that means you may need to work around them in some ways, or find other people in the space who can support you and be an ally for you, even if this person is not going to be.
Yeah, because I think because of a lot of Black women are in corporate media and have kind of run into that situation. In my case, it was definitely somebody who clearly had not been, whoever felt like they were a member of the Black community. And I felt like a lot of that trauma,
Hmm.
because of their racial background, it was a mixed racial background, because a lot of that trauma of not feeling accepted by us, that then we became the enemy in the workplace environments, right? And so
Yes.
it's sort of like, yeah, you're bringing all of that to work, and it's playing out in different ways that are frankly exposing some nastiness and some cruelty in you. And I mean, after a certain point, I just couldn't fuck with that person anymore.
Hmm.
It just kind of is what it is. But we never had that particular conversation. But it never occurred to me to have that particular conversation. And so I wondered, after reading your book, if that would have been a constructive or helpful approach. It may not have been something that made them change their mind and say, like, okay, I'm going to become a new person that's all about championing the Black women overnight. But I wonder if it had ever even been brought to their attention that they were like that.
I think that that's an interesting, idea. And you're right. It may not have changed their mind or their behavior, but I think it could have given them some space to like call out, like, hey, I see what you're doing. Right. Because you're right that a lot of when we find ourselves having very strong reactions to other people, most often it is about something about us. It usually is not about them. Right. And so you kind of being able to pick up on, okay, this person hasn't ever really felt accepted by the Black community, that was something that that person needed to work on. And so you having that conversation with them could have opened up something for them to make them think like, okay, well, what is going on here? Or it would have maybe forced them to say like, okay, why am I treating her that way? So who knows? It could have unlocked something. I guess we'll never know.